She was 34 years old and had exactly $11 to her name when her husband's family stood in a lawyer's office in the spring of 1888 and laughed. Thomas Whitfield had been dead 6 weeks, thrown from a wagon on the Larkspur Road, and his mother, Augusta Whitfield, had made it plain from the first night of mourning that a Callaway girl with no land and no family behind her had no place at a Whitfield table. It was Augusta who arranged the will's reading, Augusta who smiled thin and satisfied when the lawyer announced that while the ranch, the cattle, and the silver claim passed to Thomas's brother Reginald, the widow would receive the old manor house on Corbett Ridge, and all its contents, valued, the lawyer read aloud with visible discomfort, at $3. The room had erupted in laughter, Reginald's loudest of all. She had walked out with her $11, a trunk of clothes, and a deed to a rotting, condemned house nobody in the county would set foot in after dark. She paid the $3 the very next morning, if only to spite them, and moved into a manor with a caved porch, broken windows, and a name for being haunted. What she did not know, what no living Whitfield knew, was that somewhere inside those crumbling walls, a secret had been waiting 26 years to be found, one that would not only change the whole of her life but settle a debt the town of Larkspur Hollow had been quietly bleeding from for a generation. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Mercy Whitfield. If you have ever been handed the smallest, most overlooked thing in the room and told it was all you deserved, we would love to hear about it in the comments below. Mercy Callaway had been raised in a cabinetmaker's shop in Bozeman, the only child of a quiet, exacting man named Henry Callaway, who built furniture the way some men built cathedrals, with patience, with reverence, with an eye for the places where beauty and function agreed to meet. Her mother had died delivering her, and so it had been Henry and Mercy alone in that sawdust-scented shop for the whole of her girlhood, and what he could not give her in the softness of a mother, he gave her in the discipline of his craft. By the time she was 10, she could tell the difference between white oak and red oak with her eyes closed, simply by the smell of the shavings. By 14 she could dovetail a drawer so tight it needed no glue. And by 16 her father had begun teaching her the old trade secrets passed down to him by his own master in Philadelphia, how furniture makers of an older, more suspicious age had built hidden compartments into desks and hutches and headboards, false bottoms and false backs, panels that looked like solid wood but gave, if you knew exactly where to press, to reveal a hollow space beneath. A well-built house, her father used to tell her, sanding some tabletop by lamplight, keeps its secrets the same way a well-built cabinet does. Not by hiding them behind locks. By hiding them behind eyes that don't know how to look. Mercy had loved him fiercely, and had loved the trade almost as fiercely, though there was no place in Montana territory for a woman to call herself a cabinet maker outright, and so she had contented herself with mending, with small repairs, with quietly doing half the real work in her father's shop while customers spoke to him as if he alone had done it. She met Thomas Whitfield the year she turned 26, when he'd come through Bozeman buying lumber for a new bunkhouse on the family ranch outside Larkspur Hollow. He was not a loud man, not like his brother Reginald, and there was something almost apologetic in the way he'd admired her father's work, running his hand over a chest of drawers and asking real questions about the joinery instead of simply naming a price. He came back 3 more times that season on invented errands, and by the following spring, he had asked Henry Callaway for his daughter's hand with the kind of nervous formality that told Mercy everything she needed to know about the sort of husband he'd be. Henry had only one condition, that Thomas never make her ashamed of where she came from, and Thomas had kept that promise faithfully for the 8 years of their marriage, even as his mother made it clear, again and again, in 100 small unkindnesses, that a cabinetmaker's daughter was not what she had wanted for her favored son. Mercy bore it with the same quiet patience her father had taught her over a workbench. You do not fight wood that resists you, you learn its grain, and you work with what is true about it rather than what you wish were true. She had believed in her heart that time and her own steadiness would soften Augusta eventually. She had not yet learned that some grain runs contrary all the way through, and no amount of careful handling will change it. Thomas died on a gray April morning when the wagon axle snapped on the switchback above Miller's Creek, and Mercy's whole life narrowed, in the space of one telegram, down to a widow's black dress and a house full of relatives who had never wanted her there in the first place. She had no children to hold on to, no property in her own name. Everything she now understood had always belonged to the Whitfield estate, administered by Whitfield men, and with Thomas gone she was, in the coldest legal sense, a stranger in the house she had lived in for 8 years. Reginald did not wait even a full week of mourning before he began speaking of arrangements, and Augusta did not wait even that long to begin packing Mercy's belongings into a single trunk. The will, when it was finally read, confirmed what Mercy had already begun to suspect. The Whitfields intended to be rid of her as cheaply and as thoroughly as the law would allow. $3. A ruined house on a ridge nobody wanted, that the family itself had abandoned a quarter-century before under circumstances no one spoke of plainly, and that half the town believed was cursed on account of the old stories about the first Mrs. Whitfield, who had died up there alone and half out of her mind, some said, in the year 1862. It was meant to be an insult dressed up as a formality. Mercy took it anyway and paid her $3 because $11 minus $3 still left her something, and because some stubborn ember in her, her father's ember she would later think, refused to walk away from Larkspur Hollow with nothing at all, even if nothing was, in the town's estimation, exactly what she'd been given. The manor stood a mile and a half above the town proper, at the top of a switchbacked road grown thick with chokecherry and wild rose, and Mercy walked up to it for the first time on a cold, bright morning with her trunk left behind at the boarding house and nothing in her hands but the deed and a borrowed lantern. It had once been a fine house, she could see that immediately, in the way the ruin of a fine thing always shows through, tall windows now boarded or broken, a wraparound porch collapsed on its north side, a stone chimney standing straight and proud amid all the sagging timber around it like a man refusing to bow. The door groaned on a single hinge when she pushed it open, and the smell that met her was not, as she'd braced herself for, the smell of rot and decay, but something drier and older, dust and cold ash and the particular scent of good wood that has simply been left alone too long. She stood in the front hall a long while before she did anything else, simply looking, the way her father had taught her to look at any piece before touching it, not to see what was broken but to see what had been built and why and by whose hand. It took her 3 days of sweeping and airing and boarding up the worst of the broken windows before she felt she could call any single room of the house livable, and it was on the third evening, working by lamplight in what had clearly once been a study, that she found the first thing that told her this house was not quite what everyone believed it to be. She was running her hands along a built-in bookshelf, checking the joints out of old habit more than any purpose, when her fingers caught on a seam that did not belong, a hairline gap in what looked like solid paneling, positioned exactly where her father had taught her such gaps were meant to be hidden, in the shadow beneath a shelf, disguised by the natural grain of the wood. Her heart began to beat harder before her mind had even caught up to why. She pressed, the way Henry Calloway had shown her 100 times on 100 ordinary cabinets, feeling for the give rather than forcing it, and a narrow panel swung inward with a small dry sigh, revealing a shallow compartment no bigger than a bread box. Inside, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth gone brittle and yellow with age, she found a single folded letter, the ink faded to the color of weak tea, addressed in a woman's careful hand to no one at all, only to whoever finds this and has the patience to look. The letter was not long, but Mercy read it 3 times before she could make herself set it down. It was signed Eleanor Whitfield and dated the spring of 1862, and it spoke in the guarded, circling language of someone afraid to be too plain even in private, of a wrong her husband Josiah had done, and of a debt she believed with her whole soul would one day have to be repaid, whether by him or by someone braver who came after. She wrote that she had hidden what is owed inside the house itself, in a place built by a craftsman she trusted, and that she had left signs for anyone patient enough and honest enough to follow. She did not say what the wrong was, not in that letter, not plainly, only that it involved the land the town of Larkspur Hollow was built on, and the families who had once held it before the Whitfield name did. Mercy sat with that letter until the lamp burned low, and for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt something in her chest that was not grief. It was closer to purpose. Over the following weeks, Mercy did not tell a soul in Larkspur Hollow what she had found. She had learned enough of Whitfield pride to know that a secret half understood was more dangerous, in that family's hands, than no secret at all, and so she kept her discovery close and returned to it with her father's patience, room by room, wall by wall, running her hands along paneling and baseboard and mantel the way another woman might have prayed. She found the second clue inside a false-backed linen cupboard on the second floor. Not another letter this time, but a hand-drawn map of the county as it had looked in the 1850s, before the Whitfield Ranch existed at all, with a dozen small parcels marked out and initialed, names Mercy did not recognize but which she copied faithfully into a notebook of her own. She began to understand, piecing the map against what little she could learn from old county records at the courthouse in town, where the clerk, a kind, curious man named Otis Feld, helped her without asking too many questions, that the land now called the Whitfield Ranch had once belonged to a dozen different homesteading families, most of them poor, several of them believed by the old-timers to have been part Metis or Blackfeet by marriage, families who had, according to the fragile paper trail Mercy began to assemble, sold their claims to Josiah Whitfield in the spring of 1862 for prices so far beneath fair value that the word sale barely applied. Several had simply vanished from the county records after that spring, no further trace of them in any ledger Otis could find. Eleanor Whitfield, it seemed, had known exactly what her husband had done, had perhaps even watched him do it, and had spent the rest of her short, unhappy life trying to build a way for the truth to outlive her silence. The third and final piece came in November, nearly 7 months after Mercy had first walked up the Ridge Road, when a hard early snow drove her to finally open the sealed hearth in the old dining room, a fireplace bricked shut so long ago that even the mortar had a settled, permanent look to it. It was, in truth, her father's oldest trick of all. A false hearth was the easiest hiding place in any house, because who would ever think to look for treasure inside a chimney, and Mercy had saved it for last only because she had not, until that point, quite believed she would find anything so large. Behind the brick, in a cavity lined with cedar to keep out damp, she found an iron strongbox, and inside the strongbox, wrapped in what had once been good wool, a leather ledger nearly 2 inches thick, and beneath the ledger, packed carefully in oilcloth, more gold coin than Mercy had ever seen gathered in one place in her life. The ledger, written in a careful, agonized hand that could only have been Eleanor's, recorded every transaction her husband had made in that spring of 1862, the true worth of each parcel of land beside the pittance he had actually paid, the names of every family, and in a column at the very end, a running sum of what Eleanor herself believed was owed in restitution, to the descendants of every name on that list, should any of them ever be found. She had apparently spent years quietly and alone, converting a portion of the ranch's early silver profits into coin and hiding it away for that purpose, a slow, secret penance her husband never knew she was performing, right up until her own death left the debt unpaid and the gold sealed in darkness for 26 years. Mercy sat on the cold dining room floor with the ledger open across her knees and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had not been handed a worthless ruin at all. She had been handed the one thing in all of Larkspur Hollow that the Whitfield family could never buy back and never entirely bury, the truth kept safe by a woman as unwanted in her own time as Mercy had felt in hers, waiting for someone with the patience to look properly at what had been dismissed as nothing. She did not act rashly. She spent the better part of a month quietly cross-referencing every name in Eleanor's ledger against county records, church registries, and the memories of the oldest residents of Larkspur Hollow, with Otis Feld's careful help, and found that of the 12 original families, 3 still had living descendants in the region. A widow named Constance Lightfoot living modestly on the edge of town, a family called Broussard now running a small mercantile 2 counties over, and an elderly man named Amos Redbird, whom the townsfolk generally overlooked entirely, tending a few sheep on land he did not legally own though his grandmother had been born on it. It was only once Mercy had this much settled in her own mind, and had made careful copies of the ledger's key pages hidden in 3 separate places, that word of what she'd found began, inevitably, to slip loose in a town too small to keep any real secret long. It reached Reginald Whitfield within the week. Reginald came up the Ridge Road himself for the first time since his father's funeral, and he did not come pleasantly. He stood in the half-restored front hall of the manor his family had abandoned in shame a generation before and informed Mercy, in the flat tone of a man accustomed to being obeyed, that whatever she believed she had found belonged, by simple fact of the deed, to her, but that any accusation against the Whitfield name would be met with lawyers, with the full weight of the family's remaining influence in the territory, and, he added with a coldness that made even Otis Feld shift uneasily beside her with whatever else might prove necessary. He offered her, in the same breath, a sum of money, a real sum, not $3 this time, to simply burn the ledger and hold her tongue. Mercy listened to the whole of it without flinching, because she had spent 8 years learning the particular arithmetic of Whitfield contempt, and she understood that Reginald's anger was not really about a debt owed to 12 forgotten families. It was about a woman his mother had mocked as worthless, proving, in the plainest terms imaginable, that she had been the only one in that entire family with the patience to see what was truly there. She told him no. She told him, in a voice she was almost surprised to hear come out so steady, that she had not spent her whole life learning to read what other people overlooked only to look away now that it mattered most, and that the ledger and its truth would go to the territorial land office and to the county newspaper whether he liked it or not out of spite toward the Whitfield name, she said, but out of a debt she felt she now shared, having lived under that name herself, and having eaten at that family's table while other families went without what should have been rightfully theirs. Reginald left the manor white with fury, and for a tense fortnight afterward, Mercy heard rumors moving through Larkspur Hollow like weather, that the widow up on the ridge had gone mad the way old Eleanor had, that she was trying to steal Whitfield land with a forged book, that no one ought to trust a word she said. She kept working through it all, because her father had taught her that the surest answer to doubt was not argument but proof, carefully, patiently assembled. The proof came together at last in the county courthouse on a January morning, in front of a visiting circuit judge named Harlan Weiss, a newspaperman from the Larkspur Sentinel, and a small gathering of townsfolk drawn as much by curiosity as conviction. Mercy laid out Eleanor's ledger page by page, cross-referenced against Otis Feld's patient records, against the original 1862 land filings that showed, in the county's own hand, the absurdly low sums paid for parcel after parcel, against sworn statements from Constance Lightfoot and from Amos Redbird's own grandmother's church baptismal record, which placed her birth squarely on land the Whitfield ranch now claimed. Reginald's lawyer argued vigorously that a dead woman's private guilt proved nothing about legal ownership, that grief and superstition had addled a widow's judgment, that the whole matter ought to be dismissed as the fantasy of a woman with a grudge and too much time alone in a haunted house. But Judge Weiss, turning the ledger's pages himself, noted aloud that Eleanor Whitfield's arithmetic matched the county's own filings almost to the dollar, that this was not the ledger of a madwoman but the ledger of someone with a far clearer conscience than the men who had profited from her silence, and that whatever the law's final word on old land titles, the moral debt recorded in that leather book was, in his considered opinion, plain as daylight. What followed was not, in the end, a courtroom triumph so much as a slow unwinding of shame. The Territorial Land Office opened a formal inquiry into the 1862 transactions that would drag on, as such things did, for the better part of 2 years, but Reginald Whitfield standing in Larkspur Hollow crumbled far faster than any court could act, as neighbor after neighbor who had once tipped their hat to the Whitfield name began instead to recall, aloud and often, the stories they'd half known all along about the old families who'd simply disappeared from the county rolls one hard spring. A generation back. Reginald did not go to prison, and Mercy had never wanted that. What she wanted, and what she got, was truth spoken plainly in a place that had spent 26 years pretending not to know it. She used a portion of the gold Eleanor had hidden, not all of it, for she believed to the end that it belonged first to the families it was meant for, to settle a fair sum on Constance Lightfoot, on the Broussard family, and on Amos Redbird, whose few acres of sheep pasture were formally and permanently deeded back to his name within the year, an old man weeping without shame in the Larkspur courthouse the day the paper was signed. The remainder, along with a share of her own $3 inheritance's newly discovered worth, Mercy put toward rebuilding what the town itself had let fall into disrepair alongside the manor: a schoolhouse roof that had leaked for a decade, a well that had gone bad, a small clinic that Larkspur Hollow had never quite managed to afford, which the townsfolk, in a gesture that made Mercy's throat tighten the first time she heard it spoken aloud, voted to name the Eleanor House after a woman none of them had ever met but whose long-buried conscience had finally been allowed to speak. She was 34 years old and had $11 to her name when the Whitfields laughed and handed her a $3 ruin, believing they were rid of her for good. What they had not understood, and what Mercy Whitfield herself had only half understood in that first cold walk up the Ridge Road, was that value is rarely where the loud and the comfortable expect to find it, and that a house, like a woman, like a debt, like a truth, can be dismissed as worthless by people who have simply never learned how to look. Her father had spent a lifetime teaching her to see the seam in the wood that others walked past without noticing, and it was that same patient, unglamorous attention that let her find what an entire town and an entire family had spent a generation failing to see: a dead woman's guilt, honestly kept, waiting only for someone honest enough to receive it. Mercy did not become wealthy in any way the Whitfields would have recognized as triumph. She became instead the caretaker of a truth restored, the neighbor who had turned $3 mock dollars into a schoolhouse roof and a return deed and an old man's tears of disbelief, and in Larkspur Hollow in the years that followed, that came to be worth considerably more than laughter ever had. Thank you for sitting with us through Mercy Whitfield's story tonight. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need a reminder that the smallest, most overlooked things are sometimes carrying the most weight, and we'd love to know in the comments below, what is a time you found real value in something the world around you had already written off? Until next time, stay close.